Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Evidence for Belief, a series which examines evidence for the existence of God. We're now going to investigate the historical evidence that supports the teaching of the Christian Bible about God and about Jesus in particular. So let me start by asking a question. Is there any historical evidence for the intervention of the Christian God in human history? After all, if God exists, you would hope and expect that he hasn't just created our world, set it in motion like a wind-up clock, and then departed for an extended holiday, leaving us to our own devices. One would hope that the God who went to the trouble of creating our world isn't some absentee landlord who doesn't care what goes on here after he's opened the front door and given us the keys. So, is there any historical evidence of God's intervention in the world? Well, yes, there is, absolutely. The Christian Bible is replete with accounts of God's regular intervention throughout human history, often involving extraordinary miracles. These miracles range from personal miracles such as healings of various diseases to spectacular miracles at the national and global level. The parting of the Red Sea, the Great Flood, city walls miraculously collapsing, a river turning to blood, pillars of cloud and fire that led a nation through the desert, voices from thunderstorms, and dozens more examples. In fact, the Bible is positively brimming with accounts of God's extraordinary interventions in human history. But that doesn't count, I hear you say. The Bible is a religious book. Yeah, of course it's a religious book. That's because it provides accounts of God's intervention in the world, which is exactly what skeptics are asking for. Can you see the circular contradiction that's operating here? Skeptics ask for historical documented evidence of God's intervention in the world, but when it's presented to them in the Bible, they dismiss it because it's written by people who've come to believe in God because of his intervention in the world. In other words, the problem with these accounts in the Bible is that they are in the Bible. What I mean is that many people dismiss the Bible as fanciful fairy stories written by religious fanatics, and they tend not to regard it as a reliable historical record. So in this episode, I'm going to present some evidence as to why the Bible should, at the very least, be regarded as a reliable historical document. And I'm going to examine 3 points. The Bible was largely written by converted unbelievers. Secondly, it has significant archaeological corroboration. And thirdly, there is significant extra-biblical literary corroboration, particularly for the life of Jesus. So let's look at the first of these. The Bible was largely written by converted unbelievers. You see, what I find utterly compelling about the Bible is that it is almost entirely written by people who started out not knowing God or not believing in him, but who became convinced of his existence because of their dramatic encounters with God. So, to the skeptic, I would say the Bible is written by people who started out just like you, and that's what makes it so convincing. You see, the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, is the story of an ancient nation, the Israelites, whose founders and patriarchs were called out of a highly paganistic world of idol worship, human sacrifice, and superstitious worship of a plethora of gods. And gradually, over time, they were taught to trust and follow the true God. Now, it's not a very successful story, however, because each new generation of Israelites tended to drift away from God and even stop believing in him and return to their previous pagan practices, needing to be convinced all over again of God's reality. It's a continual story of God repeatedly revealing himself in dramatic, sometimes miraculous ways in order to convince a new generation of skeptics and apostates. And it is this brutal honesty of the Old Testament that I think makes it so convincing. You see, if you were making up a story about God, you would surely be much more likely to craft a story that depicted people who followed their God devotedly and were rewarded for their faithfulness. The New Testament, I think, is even more impressive. Many of the writers of the New Testament wrote from a position of having once been skeptics, particularly skeptics about the resurrection of Jesus, but they eventually became utterly convinced. The Apostle Paul, for example, started out not only as a skeptic, but arresting the followers of Jesus and putting them to death, but was eventually converted himself when he had a dramatic encounter with the risen Jesus. Paul's skepticism was so radically overturned by this encounter with Jesus that he became arguably the most prolific church planter in Christian history and ended up writing 14 of the 27 books of the New Testament. Even the apostles Matthew, Peter and John, who between them wrote 2 of the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus and 6 other New Testament books, were originally sceptical about the resurrection of Jesus, and they had to be convinced before they acknowledged its truth and came to believe in his divinity. So that amounts to a total of 22 out of 27 books of the New Testament that were written by people who were quite slow to be convinced. So my point is that the Bible is a book largely written by skeptics who eventually had their skepticism overturned by their dramatic personal encounters with God. Now let's look at the second point. Number 2, the Bible has significant archaeological corroboration. And I'll deal with the Old Testament first. The Old Testament is a part of the Bible that describes the thousands of years prior to Jesus. So we're talking about the very distant past. The corroborating evidence for the Old Testament is therefore fairly limited, and that's simply because it's so long ago that very few literary works and artefacts have survived through to the present day. And this is true for any historical events from way back then. Occasionally, however, historians and archaeologists uncover a document or an artefact that confirms a part of the Bible's story. For example, the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, mentions a group of people called the Hittites several times, a nation of people who lived in cities near Canaan. But for a long time, the Hittites were unknown and unmentioned outside of the Bible. There were no references to them in any other literary work from antiquity. So secular historians, because of this, claimed that this was an example of the Bible's fanciful nature. The writers of the Bible were just making stuff up. But then, in 1906, a Hittite city was uncovered east of Ankara in Turkey, along with manuscripts that provided detailed descriptions of Hittite culture. And the city was dated to the time period that fitted perfectly with the biblical narrative. So with that one discovery, decades of skepticism were overturned and the biblical account was verified. Also, earlier last century, secular historians were adamant that Moses could not have written the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, because Moses lived around 1500 BC, and the earliest recorded written language was 1100 BC. Now, this was a big criticism of the Bible by secular historians who claimed that the writing of these books by Moses in 1500 BC and the recording of the events at that time was just another example of the completely fanciful nature of the Bible, because there simply was no written language back then. They also stated that the city of Ebla, mentioned in the Old Testament, didn't exist because no reference to it had ever been found in other ancient writings. But then, in 1964, the ancient city of Ebla was discovered by archaeologists at an excavation site in modern-day Syria, and it was dated at 2300 BC, 800 years earlier than Moses. But even more extraordinary was that they uncovered 11,000 clay tablets showing a completely developed written language. Furthermore, the writings in this pagan city, and this is important, bear in mind that this is a pagan city, these writings contained references to the miracles of the Hebrew God, as well as references to Ishmael, that's Abraham's son, to Jerusalem and Sodom and Gomorrah. Moving from the Old Testament to the New Testament, which is the story of Jesus and the early church, there is also significant archaeological corroboration. Places frequented by Jesus, where he preached and supposedly worked miracles, have been uncovered by archaeological digs and verified by other historical documents. For instance, the Pool of Siloam is mentioned in the Gospels as a place in Jerusalem where Jesus healed a man. But the pool had never been found by any archaeological dig, and there was no reference to it in any other writings from history. So, for a very long time, skeptics claimed that this was evidence that the New Testament is simply a collection of myths, and that the events described in it didn't really happen. But then, in 2004, so not so long ago, the Pool of Siloam was discovered by archaeologists right where the Bible said it was supposed to be. The archaeologists just had to dig a little bit deeper. And once again, the narrative of the Bible was confirmed and the skeptics were silenced. Now, these few examples are just the tip of the iceberg. There are literally hundreds of similar examples that I could go through, where secular critics claimed that something in the Bible was fanciful, only to have their criticism overturned by subsequent archaeological discoveries which validated the biblical account. In his work, Biblical Archaeology, Factual Evidence to Support the Historicity of the Bible, Dr. Paul L. Meyer writes, "Ever since scientific archaeology started a century and a half ago, the consistent pattern has been this. The hard evidence from the ground has borne out the biblical record again and again and again. The Bible has nothing to fear from the spade." Dr. Meyer goes on to cite hundreds more examples of archaeological discoveries which have verified the historical claims of the Bible, references to people, places, or things which were once regarded as fictitious by skeptics and have since been verified by archaeological digs or the discovery of corroborating historical documents. In fact, there have never been any archaeological discoveries that have contradicted something in the Bible. Never. But I want to now move on to the third and I think most important point. There is significant extra biblical literary corroboration for the life of Jesus. You know, I occasionally encounter someone who believes that Jesus never existed. Indeed, among the skeptic community, there is a strong push to discredit the biblical narrative about Jesus as merely superstitious ancient myth. For example, the noted atheist Richard Dawkins argued this point for a very long time, until he was corrected by historians. The claim that Jesus never existed is an absurd position to hold that completely overlooks the considerable weight of historical evidence. In my experience, the only people who hold this view are those who have no historical training and have not bothered to examine the evidence. The life of Jesus as a real person in history is substantiated by an impressive array of documents and writers from antiquity, quite separate from the Bible. Now, these were people who wrote about Jesus and were not Christians. They were Greeks, Romans, Syrians, and Jews who lived at the time of Jesus or very soon after him, and who referred to Jesus as a real person. For example, there's Flavius Josephus, who lived from 37 to 100 AD. And in his book, Antiquities of the Jews, he mentions Jesus twice. And although several statements in one of those passages are believed to be later interpolations by Christian copyists, the scholarly reconstruction of this quote, removing those possible interpolations, is nonetheless very significant. Let me read it to you. "Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many, both of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." That's from Antiquities 18.3.3. A second passage by Josephus in the same book refers to, and I quote, "Jesus who was called Christ," and he also mentions James, the brother of Jesus. Then there's Cornelius Tacitus, 56 to 120 AD. He was a Roman senator and a highly regarded historian, and in his work, The Annals of Imperial Rome, he refers to Jesus and the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Nero. Then there's Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, 69 to 122 AD. He was another prominent Roman historian, and he mentions Jesus and the early Christians in his work, The 12 Caesars. Then there's Pliny the Younger, 61 to 113 AD. He was a Roman governor and a writer, and he mentions the followers of Jesus in a letter to Emperor Trajan. Then there's Mara bar Serapion, who was a first century Syrian philosopher who wrote a letter to his son which includes a reference to Jesus as an historical person. Then there's the Babylonian Talmud, which began to be written at the time of Jesus, and it mentions him in several places, including this passage, which is quite extraordinary, describing his crucifixion. Let me read it to you. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshua, that's the Hebrew name for Jesus, Yeshua was hanged. Now, this is the colloquial expression for crucifixion because the victims of crucifixion literally did hang from the nails in their hands and feet. And then he goes on. Before the execution took place, a herald cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." Now, I'll talk more about that reference in the next episode, but this reference to Jesus practicing sorcery is a reference to his miracles. Then there's Thales, a first century Greek historian who wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world after the Trojan War. And he described the crucifixion of Jesus and the supernatural darkness that covered the whole land as that event unfolded. And then there's Phlegon of Tralles, a second century Greek historian. And he also references the supernatural darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Now, despite the fact that these writers were not followers of Jesus, in fact, most of them were openly hostile toward him, they are all united in their affirmation that Jesus was a real historical figure who attracted a large following and who was ultimately crucified by the Jews. And those are just a few examples. Historian Dr. Gary Habermas cites a total of 39 sources outside the Bible which verify the life of Jesus. However, despite such clear and, I have to say, overwhelming historical corroboration, the uninformed view that Jesus never even existed still persists among some skeptics. It's in response to this naive position that respected historian and professed atheist Dr. Neil Carter once wrote in his blog, "I can't believe I'm feeling the need to do this, but today I'd like to write a brief defense of the historicity of Jesus. When people in the skeptic community argue that Jesus never existed, they are dismissing a large body of work for which they have insufficient appreciation, most often due to the fact that they themselves have never formally studied the subject." Dr. Bart Ehrman is another respected historian and also a professed agnostic. In other words, very uncertain whether there even is a God. Several years ago, he was interviewed by the Atheist Guy on Atheist Radio, which is an internet radio station whose sole aim is to discredit Christianity and propose atheism. Here is a transcript of part of that interview. Atheist Guy: "Do you believe that Jesus actually existed?" Dr. Ehrman: "Yes. There is no serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. There are a lot of people who want to write sensational books claiming that Jesus didn't exist, but I don't know any serious scholar who doubts the existence of Jesus." Now, at this point, the Atheist Guy is a bit perplexed. That's not the answer he was expecting from an agnostic historian. And so he asks, "But there are historians who disagree with you, aren't there?" Dr. Ehrman: "None that I've ever heard of. Not serious historians. I know thousands of scholars of the ancient world, and I don't know any one of these scholars who disagree." So, in summary, in this episode we've seen that archaeology has consistently shown the Bible to be a reliable historical document, and, more particularly, first century literary evidence has corroborated Jesus as a real person in history. I hope you're now convinced of that if you weren't already. You simply can't dismiss Jesus as a mythological figure. Of course, it is one thing to concede that Jesus existed as a real person in history. It's quite another, isn't it, to accept the accounts of his miracles. And it's these miracles of Jesus and his resurrection in particular, which I think are the sticking point for many people. Examining the evidence for the miracles of Jesus and for his resurrection is the topic of the next episode. For more information, you can check out my books, which are available on my website, smartfaith.net, where you can also subscribe to my weekly blog. Thanks for watching episode 16. Please check out episode 17, and in the meantime, have a great day.